Welcome to Liberty Legion, where sensibility rises above radicalism and liberty stands above all. Join us as we bring common sense back into the conversation for freedom and for the future. Now here's your host, Aaron.
All right, I am super excited to dive into today's subject, and it has become a rather hot topic due to the recent election of a certain mayor in New York City. We're going to talk about socialism, and this is likely going to be a two-part episode, so you'll have the first part this week and the next part the following week, just because I have 6 pages of notes. I want to talk about what socialism promises. I want to talk about some of the policies being advocated for in the United States, real-world examples of how those policies worked out, some historical context on other socialist nations, and then go into kind of free market solutions and the free market information you need to combat the socialism and socialist narrative. So hopefully you are ready for a lot of information today, and I'm excited to share it with you. Thanks for joining for another episode of Liberty Legion. I'm your host, Erin Brantley. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and comment where you're listening from. I love to hear from y'all, and I'm super excited to get started. So here we go. All right, so why is socialism resurging in American politics? And I would argue there's a multitude of reasons, right? We saw Mamdani get elected in New York City. We see kind of this fracture within the Democrat Party happening right now as far as the Democrat socialist wing and then the establishment classical liberal wing. I'm curious how that is going to be reconciled over the next few years and how many more socialist candidates we're going to see in next year's elections. So let's start out with what socialism promises. And what is it? So socialism is a political and economic theory. It advocates for collective or governmental ownership and administration of means of production, such as capital and land, for the community as a whole. And in today's times, people are desperate. So many people are living paycheck to paycheck. It's so disheartening to hear that you likely can't afford to buy a home until you're close to 40. The younger generation especially is very disenfranchised with the state of America and how far the dollar doesn't go today, right? And we see a ton of economic equality. And again, you can call it what you want, but we can't deny that the middle class has been shrinking. And we need to figure out a way to grow that middle class and strengthen the middle class financially. Wage stagnation, housing affordability. The American dream is just farther and farther out of reach. I don't think anyone can deny that. And if you do deny it, I'm just not sure you're being objective. And we see a huge generational shift from Gen Z to the baby boomers, right? Gen Z is much more distanced from the Cold War, and they don't really associate socialism with authoritarians like the previous generations did, who still have, the Cold War and everything that unfolded then fresh in their minds. They also, I think, fully misunderstand the Nordic nations and their economic model. We'll discuss that later on, probably in part 2, because they are in fact free markets. Okay, so the Nordic nations are not full socialist nations. So let's explore the promises versus the realities of socialism. Some of the promises sound really great, and that's why I feel socialism is making such a resurgence in the United States. Sounds like a great utopia. If human nature didn't exist, if we didn't live in the real world, it would be fantastic. But based on historical context and what we've seen under socialist nations, it doesn't turn out to be a utopia, at least in my opinion. So socialism promises equality and fairness, universal basic services. You're going to hear a lot of advocating for universal healthcare, government-owned housing, full free education, college education especially, and free childcare as well, just as some examples. Social ownership of the means of production. So if there is a company, then the workers own the means of production. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of that a little bit later on. Elimination of profit motives. So they want to have a production for need and not for profit. Completely different than a capitalist society, which is going to rely on profit to drive the urge for innovation, for efficiency, for a well-run business. And instead, under socialism, it's going to be a move just for production, not profit. All right. So let's get into the economic realities of some of these socialist policies. There is frequently in historical socialist nations that we've seen, we're talking USSR, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, a misallocation of resources under central planning. These quotas that these central planners set for various products lead to absurd products, empty shelves, because central planners, they just can't match supply and demand. That is an extraordinarily complicated, difficult thing to do just as a central planner. Instead of in capitalism, we're allowing the markets to do that, right? They're naturally managing that. And like I said, central planners lack the vast real-time information available to a market economy about consumer preferences and relative scarcity. These are incredibly complex, especially when we're talking about something as big as a whole nation's economy. They're going to have a very difficult time getting enough data to properly plan. And we saw these failings and shortcomings, especially in the USSR. Like I mentioned earlier, there's very little incentive for innovation or efficiency because production quotas replace profit. One example of this is the Soviet Union's production of useless goods just to meet quotas, leading to empty shelves and shortages. Fun fact, the USSR struggled with zero toilet paper under a socialist regime. It's interesting. The next thing you're likely to see in a socialist nation would be price controls, and that's going to automatically lead to shortages, along with black markets and overall decline in product quality. There's no reason to try to have a high quality product because you're not competing with anyone else. One example of these price controls is actually here in the United States. So President Nixon in 1970 implemented a wage and price freeze. And this initially slowed inflation. They were facing really heavy inflation, things were unaffordable, the economy was in crisis, but it ultimately led to severe shortages of goods, long lines at the grocery stores, and empty grocery shelves. So they reversed that pretty quickly. It was a failed experiment. Another example, and this is a hot one, especially when we talk about New York City, is rent control. And rent control policies typically lead to a shortage of rental units. There's a decline in property maintenance as landlords lack incentive to invest, and there can be discrimination in tenant selection. One example of this is St. Paul, Minnesota. In November 2021, voters approved rent control, and this capped rent hikes at 3% annually. It was not linked to inflation, and new construction was not exempt. It applied to all types of rentals and buildings of any age, which is unusual. This was a pretty heavy-handed rent control policy compared to what we've seen in states like California, New York even previously. And we need to clarify the difference between rent control and rent stabilization. So rent control has hard set rent caps, and that's exactly what St. Paul was doing. Rent stabilization allows for yearly rent increases, but they're usually just a small percentage of the previous year's rent. So rent control is, hey, hard cap, this is what rent can be. This is the ceiling of where rents can be. Rent stabilization is like, you can increase, but it's going to have to just be a small percentage based on the previous year's rents. So the biggest or most drastic result, I would say, of rent control, and you can go look into St. Paul and see how much new residential construction dropped, and it was 80+%, whereas Minneapolis saw pretty steady new construction. So it was clearly a result of rent control. And this, to me, if you're going to be deterring new construction, is counterproductive to where we need to be, considering Freddie Mac estimated the housing shortage to be at 3.7 million units as of third quarter 2024. We have a huge housing shortage, and that obviously, with the basic laws of supply and demand, is driving up the cost. And we need to figure out a way to spark additional construction. And we're just not seeing that. Unfortunately, we're not seeing super effective policies, but I would say we need to cut red tape. We need to incentivize development. We need to look at reforming zoning laws in our local and state areas to boost construction. And a big part of New York City's problem is they have a shortage. Last I saw, I think it was 500,000 units in New York City. So I really am concerned that if rent control is the solution, are they just going to be adding gasoline to the fire of housing shortages? And that remains to be seen, but I highly suspect that's likely to happen. So I'm referencing a paper titled 40 Years of Rent Control, Reexamining New Jersey's Moderate Local Policies After the Great Recession. I'll link it in the show notes. But landlords, what they found in this, after New Jersey pulled back their rent control, landlords invested more in their properties. The total permitted building improvements jumped from $21 million per year from 1991 to 1994 up to $45 million per year. So more than double from 1995 to 2004. There are impacts that come alongside rent control and rent stabilization. It sounds like a great fix. It sounds like you're going to ensure everyone can afford a home, but it has long-term impacts that, in my opinion, the negative impacts outweigh the positives that come from rent control. So like I mentioned, and this is one of my primary concerns with socialism, is you see a lot of innovation stagnation. There's no profit motive. There's absence of competition, central planning inefficiencies. And again, there's a focus on quantity, not quality. So I think your overall product quality drops, your innovation drops. It just becomes kind of stagnant as far as new technology. And in today's day and age, that's vital when we're in a global market. All right, so let's go into some historical case studies of where socialism has been implemented. And I know there's a lot of arguments as from pro-socialists or even Marxists who are like, that wasn't socialism. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So stay tuned on that. I did a lot of reading on the USSR, and it was a very interesting read. Obviously, the USSR spanned decades. They claim to be a socialist economy. And although they started out pretty strong, it clearly floundered. And a lot of that had to do with, again, like I said, the central planning and the inefficiencies that come from central planning. You'd have whole empty trains going across the USSR with no products. You'd have an excess of certain products and then a complete lack of others, like no toilet paper for decades in the USSR. You had a high level of political censorship and censorship of speech. If anyone within the USSR Central Planning Commissions raised any concerns or even raised what could be seen as a challenge to socialism, they were executed. So it was heavy-handed. It was very authoritarian. I don't think anyone can deny that. And ultimately it fell because socialism didn't work. And it led to authoritarianism. It led to a drowning, floundering economy. And that was one example. That's probably one of the strongest, longest lasting examples of socialism that we've seen in recent history. And I recommend everyone go read up on the USSR. It was wild. Another example of socialism is Venezuela. And the economic breakdown and hyperinflation they're facing is a direct result of their socialist model. Venezuela was one of the richest countries in Latin America, all right? It had massive oil reserves, a really strong middle class, and high living standards. Then enter Hugo Chavez. And he entered the scene in the late 90s. You saw a massive nationalization of private industries, price controls, currency controls, social missions funded by oil money, and centralized control over media and political institutions. Now, this worked for a little while oil prices were really high, but then as soon as oil prices declined, it collapsed. And then it was handed over to Maduro, and clearly things have not improved. They have had over 7 million people leave Venezuela since 2013. And what we see in Venezuela is price controls have led to shortages, nationalization has led to corruption and inefficiency, currency controls have led to black markets, hyperprinting of money has led to hyperinflation, political repression has led to brain drain. So a ton of skilled workers have just fled. We'll move on to the next example, and that's Cuba. So Cuba, since being pushed into a socialist nation, has faced restricted freedoms, stagnation. It's a one-party totalitarian state. There's a massive suppression of economic and political dissent. You see a huge amount of empty shelves, very low wages. And this is just an example of a multitude of issues within Cuba, okay? But they are seeing massive power grid issues. The managers of these plants, they just don't have the same incentive to maintain them because there's no competition. They know that they'll have a job no matter what. And so as they're not entitled to profits, and you're seeing just a ton of rolling power outages. And when they have hurricanes, there's a massive amount of issues when those things happen. Now, the only nation that's more centrally planned is North Korea, and it's perpetually without power. Satellite images reveal that the entire country except the capital is without power at night, and only about half the population has electricity for more than 4 hours a day. So it's not a bunch of roses and sunshine over in North Korea. We also know that people are not allowed to leave, that political dissent is executed. It's very authoritarian. So from the examples I've given, you can tell North Korea, USSR, Venezuela, Cuba have all led to authoritarian regimes. And the people are ultimately suffering. They do not have as high quality of life as Americans, although people would try to lead you to believe that America is horrific and the worst country in the world, but I promise you it can get worse. You see supply product shortages, you see rolling blackouts, you see political dissent getting executed, just a multitude of issues. And it doesn't create a thriving economy. Now, some other nations tried socialism, Israel, UK, India, and all of them started to see a massive level of just stagnant growth in GDP. Their currencies were not as strong, and they rolled back on socialism. And you can go look up these. Margaret Thatcher led the way for the UK, and they recovered. It took some time, but they recovered and became a much stronger economic force once they walked away and turned away from socialism. So the argument that that's not socialism, to me, it doesn't really fly, because show me an instance in the world that it has worked. And you can't name the Nordic nations because they've come out and said, the PMs of those nations, especially I think it was Denmark, and we'll get into that in the next episode, have come out and said, we're not socialist. We love free markets. In fact, they may be a higher or a more open market than the United States. And you can't just redefine socialism based on outcomes and not structure. You end up switching to this fantasy version of socialism that's never existed. And I think there's a reason for that, because I think it flies in the face of human nature. And I just don't think you can beat a free market. And the self-correcting that a free market does with the balance of supply and demand and price indicators and consumer behavior, it's just unmatched. No central planner in the world, no matter how intelligent they are, can account for all of those signals and react, in my opinion, as quickly and as efficiently as the free market does. Like I said, socialism is an economic system typically where the state controls the means of production and central planning replaces markets. North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela do all of those. Chavez, Stalin, and Maduro all said they were building socialist states. Can't deny that. Again, we go back to the Nordic ones, but those societies are capitalist with very heavy social programs. There is a difference. Central planning will always require central power. And you can't plan an economy without enforcement, coercion, and eliminating market chaos or even dissenting opinions. It will lead to authoritarianism because you are centralizing a ton of power in the form of the entire economy of a nation. I think a huge ethical question for socialism is you have to abolish private property. And that's going to require force. If you're controlling production, it means controlling people. Once the state controls the economy, it controls everything. There's no historical counterexamples to, like I said, the USSR, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Cambodia, Laos, Eastern Europe, UK, India, Israel all failed when attempting socialism. And I mentioned they recovered when they embraced capitalism. To me, socialism relies on human nature being perfect. And we know that humans are incredibly flawed. There's a high level of corruption in even the United States government and a high level of greed for a reason. It's human nature. And if you centralize that control, it will only escalate. So if you think you have a vast gap right now, just wait. To me, the only way to avoid authoritarianism would be socialism with no state, but then it's anarchy. And not socialism. So anarchism cannot centrally plan or redistribute anything. How do you do socialism without a state? I argue it's not possible. Thank you for joining me for this episode on just the background of socialism, historical context, popular policies within socialism, and why I believe they don't work and how they haven't worked historically. Next week, we will dive into modern soft socialism in the US, as well as why free markets work better. We'll discuss the Nordic nations and how they aren't, in fact, socialist. And then we'll close out with why I believe that the free markets are absolutely superior to socialism. And I truly hope we can spread this information wide. And so individuals don't just take the low-hanging fruit of voting for socialist policies because they sound good. Sounding good and being good in reality and better for people in the long run are two very different things. So thank you again for being here. Truly appreciate it. If you haven't already, just a reminder to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening from. And I look forward to catching you on the next episode.